A groom stands at the altar, yet without a pulse. Welcome to Fabled Codex. I am your host, Mithrin. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love reading your messages. Now let's uncover the truth. It is one of the peculiarities of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that periods of indolent calm are invariably shattered by events so singular and grotesque that they would seem incredible were I not myself witness to them. Such was the case in the spring of 1891, when London awoke to a scandal that rippled alike through fashionable drawing rooms and the humbler quarters of the city. The matter began not in the dim chambers of Baker Street, but in the resplendent nave of St. George's, Hanover Square, where society weddings so frequently adorn the columns of the Times. On the morning of April the 12th, the pews were filled with the cream of London's aristocracy, assembled to witness the union of Mr. Edward St. Clair, heir to the prosperous St. Clair shipping fortune, and Miss Margaret Denham, daughter of Sir Alister Denham, a baronet whose fortune was made in railways. The bride, radiant in satin and lace, stood before the altar. The murmurs of admiration had scarcely died when all eyes turned to her intended. The bridegroom, tall, well-favored, and seemingly the very picture of health, had stepped forward to take his vows. It was at this moment that the extraordinary occurred. Mr. St. Clair, upon opening his mouth to utter the solemn "I will," swayed slightly, placed a hand upon his chest, and collapsed in full view of congregation and clergy. A physician present hurried forward, examined the stricken man, and declared in tones of horror that the gentleman had no pulse. He was lifeless. The bride's scream echoed through the nave. Panic ensued, and within moments the wedding had dissolved into chaos. Rumors spread like wildfire: poison, fainting fits, an inherited malady. The newspapers seized upon the mystery, their headlines shouting of the bridegroom without a pulse. It was at this juncture that Scotland Yard, having failed to determine whether foul play was at work, sought the counsel of Sherlock Holmes. For my part, I could not conceive how a healthy young man, hale and vigorous but an hour before, might be suddenly struck down at the very threshold of matrimony. And little did I know, as I set down these opening lines, that Holmes's cool deductions would soon pierce a veil of deception more intricate than any I had yet encountered. Would you like me to continue straight away with Section 2? The case introduction: Holmes and Watson at Baker Street, with Holmes demonstrating his deductive flair before Lestrade or the client arrives. Or would you prefer to linger here while I expand the atmosphere of the wedding scandal further? I was breakfasting with Holmes the morning after the tragic scene at St. George's, and found him unusually animated. He had tossed aside the untasted kipper and was pacing before the fireplace, his keen eyes alight with that peculiar brilliance which invariably presaged the announcement of some engrossing problem. The morning papers lay strewn about the carpet, their columns thick with sensational accounts of the affair. "Watson," said he, pausing abruptly and fixing me with his searching gaze, "you see before you a case which, to the dull eye of the ordinary man, presents the semblance of a tragedy wrought by natural causes. Yet, to the more discerning, the inconsistencies stand out like gas lamps in the fog. Here we have a man, Edward St. Clair, heir to a vast fortune, whose health was deemed exemplary, suddenly expiring upon the very words that would have bound him to one of the most advantageous alliances of the season. I ask you, what are the chances that so cruel and singular a calamity should occur by accident alone? I admitted that they must be infinitesimal, though the reports of the physicians spoke of heart failure, an aneurysm, or some unsuspected malady. Holmes gave a dry laugh. "Ah, the physicians! Admirable fellows in their way, but too much bound to the commonplace. They perceive a still heart and call it disease. Yet the conditions under which the death occurred, the dramatic timing, the social and financial implications, these are elements of design, not of chance. Consider. Had St. Clair fallen in the privacy of his chamber, I might be inclined to agree with them. But to collapse at the altar before 200 witnesses at the very utterance of his vows? No, Watson. That is a stage too carefully chosen for mere nature to have arranged." At that instant, Mrs. Hudson tapped discreetly at the door and announced Inspector Lestrade. Our diminutive acquaintance entered, rubbing his hands and clearly flustered by the magnitude of the affair. "It's a dreadful business, Mr. Holmes. The yard is all at sea, I don't mind confessing it. The family insists on foul play, the doctors are divided, and the press is baying for a culprit. Sir Alistair Denham has friends in Parliament, and I need not tell you there is pressure from above to provide some explanation. The Commissioner himself bade me place the case before you." Holmes bowed with that air of condescension which never failed to ruffle Lestrade's feathers. "You were present at the examination of the body?" "I was, sir. St. Clair was carried into the vestry where Dr. Pembroke declared him dead. No wound, no trace of poison that he could detect. The fellow's complexion was a trifle ashen, lips bluish, but that was all." "Bluish lips," murmured Holmes, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And the bride?" "Half fainting, naturally. The lady had to be conveyed to her father's house. She is inconsolable." Holmes paced once more. "And Mr. St. Clair's personal effects?" "A watch, some coins, and this." Lestrade produced a crumpled envelope upon which were scrawled a few words. Holmes took it gingerly and held it to the light. It was but a fragment, the paper torn as though hastily thrust into a pocket. The writing, bold and angular, contained but 3 words: "At once, tonight." There was no signature. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Remarkable, Watson, is it not? Here we have a gentleman expected at the altar by noon, yet in his possession is a note demanding his presence elsewhere that very evening. What errand could so pressing a summons portend? And more curious still, why was it concealed from the bride's family?" Lestrade shifted uneasily. "It might be nothing. Some matter of business." "Business, my dear Lestrade, does not employ such secrecy on the eve of marriage. Tell me, had the bridegroom enemies?" "None that we can discover. His father's firm is a powerful one, but reputable. No hint of scandal attaches to St. Clair." Holmes turned suddenly upon me. "Watson, you recall the case of the man who died of nicotine poisoning in Camberwell? The same discoloration of the lips, the same sudden collapse, yet without the slightest mark of violence. You mean to suggest that St. Clair was poisoned?" "I suggest nothing. I only observe. But this I know. There are certain agents so swift, so subtle, that they leave no trace save the cessation of life. The lips, the pallor, the absence of convulsions, these are indicative. The question is not how he died, but why he died, where and when he did." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Then you will take the case, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes smiled thinly. "My dear fellow, I took it the instant I read the word pulse upon the placard boy's lips this morning." "You may depend upon me. Watson, fetch your coat. We go first to the Denham residence. I must see the bride." Within the hour, we were seated in the drawing-room of Sir Alistair's Belgravia mansion, where the atmosphere was one of profound mourning. Heavy draperies muffled the windows, and the air was thick with the scent of lavender. Lady Denham, pale and distraught, excused herself, leaving us in the company of her daughter. Miss Margaret Denham was a young woman of delicate beauty, her eyes red with weeping yet resolute as she rose to greet us. Holmes bowed gravely. "You have sustained a cruel blow, Miss Denham," said he, "but I beg you to indulge me in a few questions. Any detail, however trifling, may prove vital." She clasped her hands. "I will tell you all I know, Mr. Holmes, though it is little." Edward was cheerful that morning, in excellent spirits. He spoke tenderly to me as we drove to the church. I noticed nothing amiss. Had he received visitors the previous evening? Only his friend, Mr. Godfrey Ewart. They dined together at the club. "I know nothing further. Mr. Ewart is well known to you?" "Since childhood." He was devoted to Edward, though I sometimes thought his devotion tinged with envy. You see, Edward was heir to a great fortune, while Godfrey's position is more modest. But they never quarreled. Holmes's eyes flickered. "Did your fiancé confide any anxieties, financial pressures, threats, or indiscretions?" "None. He was the soul of honor." Holmes bowed again. "I thank you. Rest assured I shall labor tirelessly to bring the truth to light." As we withdrew, I remarked upon Holmes's softened tone. "You are unusually gentle with the young lady," said I. Holmes shrugged. "Her grief is genuine. That is a fact established. Yet did you note, Watson, the hesitation when she spoke of Mr. Ewart?" Such pauses are the mind's unconscious protest against an untruth, or at the least, a half-truth. We must know more of this gentleman. Thus it was that our next destination became the Corinthian Club, where Mr. Godfrey Ewart was said to reside. Holmes, with his customary audacity, sent in his card, and we were ushered into a smoke-laden lounge where the young man awaited us. Ewart was tall, dark, with a sullen expression that contrasted sharply with the genial countenance of his late friend. He rose stiffly. "You are here about Edward." "A dreadful business, gentlemen." "I am undone with grief." Holmes inclined his head. "We seek only to understand his final hours." "You dined with him the night before?" "I did. We supped at the club, nothing out of the ordinary. He was in the best of health." "I cannot fathom it. Did he speak of a meeting, an appointment later that night?" Ewart's brow contracted. "No, none that I recall." Holmes drew the torn envelope from his pocket and handed it silently across. Ewart paled visibly. "Where did you get this?" "It was found upon the deceased." I know nothing of it." Holmes regarded him with a long, penetrating stare. "You will forgive me if I reserve judgment. One last matter. Your friendship with Miss Denham." "It is, I gather, of long standing?" Ewart's eyes hardened. "Yes, she is like a sister to me." "Indeed. Then you will doubtless rejoice that she is spared the misery of a loveless union." The man started as though stung. "What do you mean by that?" But Holmes had risen, gathering his coat about him. "Merely an observation. Come, Watson." In the cab returning to Baker Street, I could contain myself no longer. "Holmes, you were brutal with that poor fellow." "Surely his distress was genuine?" "Genuine, yes, but not unalloyed with guilt." "Did you not see the twitch at the corner of his mouth? The sudden pallor at sight of the note?" "He knows more than he confesses." "Mark my words, Watson, the path which began at the altar leads through Mr. Godfrey Ewart, and I shall follow it to the end." Thus the net began to tighten, though whether around the guilty or merely the unfortunate, I could not then have said. All I knew was that Holmes's eyes had taken on that cold glitter which boded ill for any man who sought to deceive him. Word count, 1400. Holmes was in one of his most meditative humors as we drove back to Baker Street. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the tips of his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, and his sharp eyes half closed, as though he were gazing inward upon some private tableau. I had come to recognize this mood as one in which his mind worked with the swiftness of a calculating engine, arranging and discarding hypotheses with relentless logic. For my part, I sat in silence, fearful of breaking the thread of his thought. At length, he roused himself with a short, decisive nod. "Watson, the matter is shaping itself. We must tread delicately, for the faintest misstep may warn our quarry. Observe how Ewart recoiled at the sight of that scrap of paper. His denial was too vehement to be genuine. Yet we must not confound knowledge with guilt. There is a chain, and Ewart is a link, though whether forged of iron or wax, I have yet to determine." "Then you do not yet believe him the murderer?" I asked. Holmes's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Murderer, Watson? You leap ahead of the facts. We do not even know with certainty that St. Clair was murdered. The physician spoke of heart failure. I have only conjecture that poison was employed. Until I have evidence, I accuse no man. What we may state with confidence is that Edward St. Clair was entangled in some secret affair which compelled him to carry upon his person a cryptic summons. The handwriting, though bold, bore peculiar angularities, such as I have seen in the scripts of clerks trained in certain continental schools. I should like to compare it with samples in St. Clair's correspondence. We found upon our return to Baker Street that Holmes's influence had already begun to bear fruit. Lestrade had dispatched a messenger with a small packet containing letters taken from St. Clair's study. Holmes spread them upon the table with the air of a man to whom the smallest trifle might be eloquent. With his lens, he examined strokes, loops, and slants, setting the torn fragment beside them. "Not St. Clair's hand," he pronounced after a few minutes, "nor that of his fiancée. The writer is one accustomed to haste, a man of decision rather than of reflection. Note the abrupt upstrokes, the impatient dashes. There is force here, but not refinement. Whoever summoned St. Clair did so with authority, not entreaty. The words "at once tonight" are not a request. They are a command. "And what do you propose to do?" I asked. "I propose, Watson, to consult the dead man himself. His body lies still at the mortuary, and there are things the living eye failed to see. You and I will view him this afternoon." It was a somber journey to that melancholy establishment in the East End. A dreary drizzle blurred the windows of our cab, and the streets glistened with wet cobblestones, as though the city itself mourned the sudden tragedy. We were admitted by a taciturn attendant who led us down chill stone corridors where the echo of our footsteps was strangely magnified. There, upon a narrow slab, lay all that remained of Edward St. Clair. The vigor and promise of youth were fled, leaving only the marble pallor of death. Holmes bent over him with professional detachment, his hands moving with delicate precision as he scrutinized lips, eyes, and fingernails. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, drawing my attention to the bluish tinge at the corners of the mouth. "It is slight yet unmistakable. Cyanosis, the mark of a system deprived of oxygen. And here, beneath the nails, the same discoloration. Such appearances are consistent with certain vegetable alkaloids, swift and subtle in their action." He drew a glass vial from his pocket and, with the assistance of the attendant, collected a few drops of blood. "This will suffice for an analysis. I suspect we shall find traces of an exceedingly rare agent. Rare, but not unknown to me. The symptomatology recalls a case reported in Vienna some years ago when a diplomat was silenced with the extract of a South American plant. I must consult my notes." He continued his examination with unwearied patience. At last his attention was drawn to a faint bruise upon the left forearm, half concealed beneath the cuff of the shirt. "Ha! What have we here?" "A puncture. Very small, almost invisible to the casual eye." "Watson, you recognize it?" "It has the appearance of an injection mark," I replied, bending closer. "Precisely. The weapon was not a cup of wine or a morsel of food, but the needle. The bruise shows the entry of a fine instrument, such as might be used by a physician, or by any man familiar with syringes. This is no case of spontaneous failure of the heart. It is cold, calculated murder." I confess I shuddered at his words. The image of the bridegroom struck down by such insidious means, while his unsuspecting bride stood smiling beside him, filled me with horror. Holmes replaced the shroud over the body and motioned me toward the door. "Come, Watson. We have learned much, but the circle is incomplete. St. Clair was slain by injection of a powerful poison. The act was deliberate. The note suggests a clandestine meeting on the night before his marriage. Our task is to discover who summoned him and what motive lay behind so monstrous a crime." As we emerged once more into the wet streets, Holmes's manner grew brisk and energetic. "We must not lose a moment. Lestrade must be set to work tracing the origin of that paper and ink. I myself shall examine the registers of the Corinthian Club. If Ewart dined with St. Clair, we must ascertain the hour of their departure and whether St. Clair kept any appointment thereafter." That evening found us once again at Baker Street, where Holmes busied himself over his chemical table. The tiny flame of a Bunsen burner glowed blue, and strange odors filled the air as he subjected the blood sample to a series of tests. I watched in silence, though my curiosity burned to know the outcome. At last he straightened, holding aloft a glass tube that shimmered faintly under the gaslight. "As I suspected," he said with quiet triumph. "The reagent betrays the presence of curarine, a most potent alkaloid derived from the arrow poisons of South America. A drop upon the tongue would paralyze within moments, stilling the heart without leaving trace perceptible to ordinary science. Only by the merest chance did I detect it. Watson, the hand that slew Edward St. Clair was not guided by common knowledge. It was guided by expert familiarity with rare toxins." I could not repress an exclamation. "Then the assassin must be a physician." Holmes raised a finger. "Or one trained in such arts. Remember, knowledge is no monopoly of the profession. There are collectors of poisons, students of pharmacology, even adventurers who have traveled in distant lands. But the possession of both substance and means, needle and vial, narrows the field considerably." At that instant, a hansom rattled to a halt outside, and moments later Lestrade was shown in. His face bore the look of a man perplexed yet eager for guidance. "I traced the note, Mr. Holmes, as you directed. The paper is of a kind sold only by a small stationer in Soho. The proprietor recalls a gentleman purchasing a packet 3 days past. Tall fellow, dark hair, dressed fashionably. He paid in coin and gave no name. But here is the curious thing. The description answers tolerably well to Mr. Godfrey Ewart." Holmes's eyes sparkled, though his expression remained composed. "Indeed, that is most enlightening. We shall not accuse prematurely, but the coincidence is notable. Did you discover aught else?" "Only that St. Clair was seen leaving the club shortly after 11. He was alone. No cabman recalls conveying him. It is as though he vanished into the fog." Holmes paced the room. A rendezvous in Soho, a note upon his person, a poison known chiefly to travelers and men of science, and a bruise upon the arm. "The lines converge, Watson, they converge!" Yet one link remains wanting, the motive. Why should any man wish to silence Edward St. Clair upon his wedding day? Lestrade spread his hands. Jealousy, perhaps, or money. The fortune he was to inherit is vast. True. But until I have proof, conjecture is but smoke. We must watch Ewart closely, for his hand is somewhere in this web. Though whether as spider or fly, we have yet to learn. Thus the night drew on, with Holmes seated in his armchair, his pipe sending blue spirals into the air, and I, unable to shake the image of the dead bridegroom, watching as his face grew ever more intent. A storm was gathering, and I felt instinctively that the next step would carry us deeper into peril and into the heart of one of the strangest enigmas of our long association. Word count: 1400. Holmes was in one of his most meditative humors as we drove back to Baker Street. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the tips of his fingers pressed together beneath his chin, and his sharp eyes half closed as though he were gazing inward upon some private tableau. I had come to recognize this mood as one in which his mind worked with the swiftness of a calculating engine, arranging and discarding hypotheses with relentless logic. For my part, I sat in silence, fearful of breaking the thread of his thought. At length, he roused himself with a short, decisive nod. "Watson, the matter is shaping itself. We must tread delicately, for the faintest misstep may warn our quarry." Observe how Ewart recoiled at the sight of that scrap of paper. His denial was too vehement to be genuine. Yet we must not confound knowledge with guilt. There is a chain, and Ewart is a link, though whether forged of iron or wax, I have yet to determine. "Then you do not yet believe him the murderer?" I asked. Holmes's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Murderer, Watson? You leap ahead of the facts. We do not even know with certainty that St. Clair was murdered. The physician spoke of heart failure. I have only conjecture that poison was employed. Until I have evidence, I accuse no man. What we may state with confidence is that Edward St. Clair was entangled in some secret affair which compelled him to carry upon his person a cryptic summons. The handwriting, though bold, bore peculiar angularities, such as I have seen in the scripts of clerks trained in certain continental schools. I should like to compare it with samples in St. Clair's correspondence. We found upon our return to Baker Street that Holmes's influence had already begun to bear fruit. Lestrade had dispatched a messenger with a small packet containing letters taken from St. Clair's study. Holmes spread them upon the table with the air of a man to whom the smallest trifle might be eloquent. With his lens, he examined strokes, loops, and slants, setting the torn fragment beside them. "Not St. Clair's hand," he pronounced after a few minutes, "nor that of his fiancée. The writer is one accustomed to haste, a man of decision rather than of reflection. Note the abrupt upstrokes, the impatient dashes. There is force here, but not refinement. Whoever summoned St. Clair did so with authority, not entreaty. The words 'at once tonight' are not a request. They are a command. And what do you propose to do?" I asked. "I propose, Watson, to consult the dead man himself. His body lies still at the mortuary, and there are things the living eye failed to see. You and I will view him this afternoon." It was a somber journey to that melancholy establishment in the East End. A dreary drizzle blurred the windows of our cab, and the streets glistened with wet cobblestones, as though the city itself mourned the sudden tragedy. We were admitted by a taciturn attendant, who led us down chill stone corridors where the echo of our footsteps was strangely magnified. There, upon a narrow slab, lay all that remained of Edward St. Clair. The vigor and promise of youth were fled, leaving only the marble pallor of death. Holmes bent over him with professional detachment, his hands moving with delicate precision as he scrutinized lips, eyes, and fingernails. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, drawing my attention to the bluish tinge at the corners of the mouth. "It is slight yet unmistakable. Cyanosis, the mark of a system deprived of oxygen. And here, beneath the nails, the same discoloration. Such appearances are consistent with certain vegetable alkaloids, swift and subtle in their action." He drew a glass vial from his pocket and, with the assistance of the attendant, collected a few drops of blood. "This will suffice for an analysis. I suspect we shall find traces of an exceedingly rare agent, rare but not unknown to me. The symptomatology recalls a case reported in Vienna some years ago, when a diplomat was silenced with the extract of a South American plant. I must consult my notes." He continued his examination with unwearied patience. At last, his attention was drawn to a faint bruise upon the left forearm, half concealed beneath the cuff of the shirt. "Ha! What have we here?" "A puncture. Very small, almost invisible to the casual eye." "Watson, you recognize it?" "It has the appearance of an injection mark," I replied, bending closer. "Precisely. The weapon was not a cup of wine or a morsel of food, but the needle. The bruise shows the entry of a fine instrument, such as might be used by a physician or by any man familiar with syringes. This is no case of spontaneous failure of the heart. It is cold, calculated murder." I confess I shuddered at his words. The image of the bridegroom struck down by such insidious means, while his unsuspecting bride stood smiling beside him, filled me with horror. Holmes replaced the shroud over the body and motioned me toward the door. "Come, Watson. We have learned much, but the circle is incomplete. St. Clair was slain by injection of a powerful poison. The act was deliberate. The note suggests a clandestine meeting on the night before his marriage. Our task is to discover who summoned him and what motive lay behind so monstrous a crime." As we emerged once more into the wet streets, Holmes's manner grew brisk and energetic. "We must not lose a moment. Lestrade must be set to work tracing the origin of that paper and ink. I myself shall examine the registers of the Corinthian Club. If Ewart dined with St. Clair, we must ascertain the hour of their departure and whether St. Clair kept any appointment thereafter." That evening found us once again at Baker Street, where Holmes busied himself over his chemical table. The tiny flame of a Bunsen burner glowed blue, and strange odors filled the air as he subjected the blood sample to a series of tests. I watched in silence, though my curiosity burned to know the outcome. At last he straightened, holding aloft a glass tube that shimmered faintly under the gaslight. "As I suspected," he said with quiet triumph. "The reagent betrays the presence of curarine, a most potent alkaloid derived from the arrow poisons of South America. A drop upon the tongue would paralyze within moments, stilling the heart without leaving trace perceptible to ordinary science. Only by the merest chance did I detect it. Watson, the hand that slew Edward St. Clair was not guided by common knowledge. It was guided by expert familiarity with rare toxins." I could not repress an exclamation. "Then the assassin must be a physician." Holmes raised a finger. "Or one trained in such arts. Remember, knowledge is no monopoly of the profession. There are collectors of poisons, students of pharmacology, even adventurers who have traveled in distant lands. But the possession of both substance and means, needle and vial, narrows the field considerably. At that instant, a hansom rattled to a halt outside, and moments later, Lestrade was shown in. His face bore the look of a man perplexed yet eager for guidance. "I traced the note, Mr. Holmes, as you directed. The paper is of a kind sold only by a small stationer in Soho. The proprietor recalls a gentleman purchasing a packet 3 days past. Tall fellow, dark hair, dressed fashionably. He paid in coin and gave no name. But here is the curious thing. The description answers tolerably well to Mr. Godfrey Ewart." Holmes's eyes sparkled, though his expression remained composed. Indeed, that is most enlightening. We shall not accuse prematurely, but the coincidence is notable. Did you discover aught else? Only that St. Clair was seen leaving the club shortly after 11. He was alone. No cabman recalls conveying him. It is as though he vanished into the fog. Holmes paced the room. A rendezvous in Soho, a note upon his person, a poison known chiefly to travelers and men of science, and a bruise upon the arm. The lines converge, Watson, they converge. Yet one link remains wanting, the motive. Why should any man wish to silence Edward St. Clair upon his wedding day? Lestrade spread his hands. Jealousy, perhaps, or money. The fortune he was to inherit is vast. True, but until I have proof, conjecture is but smoke. We must watch Ewart closely, for his hand is somewhere in this web, though whether as spider or fly we have yet to learn. Thus the night drew on, with Holmes seated in his armchair, his pipe sending blue spirals into the air, and I, unable to shake the image of the dead bridegroom, watching as his face grew ever more intent. A storm was gathering, and I felt instinctively that the next step would carry us deeper into peril and into the heart of one of the strangest enigmas of our long association. Word count: 1400. The morning dawned gray and windless, the fog lying heavy upon the streets as though it too conspired to conceal the truth from us. Holmes had slept little, pacing much of the night with his pipe glowing fitfully between his teeth. When I rose, I found him seated at the table, his violin lying across his knees, though he had not drawn bow to string. Instead, he was staring fixedly at the scrap of paper we had received from St. Clair's pocket, his long fingers drumming lightly upon the polished wood. "Watson," he said, without raising his eyes, "the human mind, like the violin, must sometimes be tuned before it can produce harmony. This note, this bruise, this poison, they are but notes of a melody whose theme has not yet declared itself. Yet it is coming. I feel it." He cast aside the violin and sprang to his feet. "Lestrade is watching Ewart, but we must cast our net wider. A single angler may fish in vain, but a dozen lines will find the shoal." We breakfasted hastily, and soon after a messenger arrived bearing an invitation from Sir Alistair Denham, requesting Holmes's presence at his residence that very afternoon. "The family presses for resolution," Holmes remarked, scanning the neat script. "We must tread carefully. Too much disclosure may rouse our enemy to flight, yet too little may lose us the cooperation of those most concerned. Come, Watson, let us hear what Sir Alistair has to say." The Denham house wore a somber air. Servants moved softly, their faces pale with restrained curiosity, while in the library Sir Alistair awaited us. He was a tall, austere man, his countenance lined with years of command in Parliament and business alike. Yet the grief etched upon his features lent him an aspect of fragility. "Mr. Holmes," said he, extending a trembling hand, "you must forgive the urgency of my request. My daughter is prostrate with sorrow, and scandal threatens to engulf us. Already whispers circulate that Edward was involved in disreputable affairs. I cannot permit her name to be dragged through the mire. You have influence with the Yard. I beg of you, find the truth." Holmes bowed with grave courtesy. "Sir Alistair, truth is the sole commodity in which I deal. I shall neither shield nor expose without cause, but you may be assured that I shall pursue the matter without fear or favor. If scandal lurks, it is the shadow cast by crime, and crime must be revealed if it is to be conquered." The baronet sank heavily into a chair. "You speak as a man of iron, sir. Yet there is flesh and blood to consider. If it should transpire that Edward was engaged in folly, debts, entanglements, God forbid a mistress, let not Margaret be exposed to public shame." Holmes's gaze hardened. "It is not shame, but secrecy, which breeds corruption. Believe me, Sir Alistair, concealment is more dangerous than truth. But enough, we must to facts. Had Edward enemies known to you? None. His life was outwardly irreproachable. But—" The old man hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door as though fearful of eavesdroppers. "There were rumors. Some months ago, I heard it whispered that Edward had been seen in questionable company, a man whose reputation is not of the cleanest. I dismissed it as idle talk. And the man's name?" Holmes's voice cut sharp as steel. Sir Alistair glanced at me, then leaned closer to Holmes. a certain Felix Montague, a speculator of dubious ventures. I warned Edward against him, but he laughed it off. He said Montague had interests abroad, and that he might prove useful in shipping matters. Holmes's eyes gleamed for a fraction of a second. Felix Montague. I know the name well. A sharper, a dabbler in continental finance, and, most significantly, a traveler in South America some years ago. Watson, do you mark the coincidence? The baronet looked from one to the other of us, perplexed. You think Montague? I think nothing. I observe that Montague's past renders him capable of acquaintance with rare poisons, and his dealings with your prospective son-in-law provide a channel of approach. That is all. Yet it is enough to warrant inquiry. Leaving the Denham residence, Holmes strode through the fog with the eagerness of a hound on the scent. Watson, we have our next move. Montague must be found. He haunts certain clubs of ill repute near the Strand, where gaming and speculation flourish under the guise of conviviality. If St. Clair was summoned to Soho, it may well have been Montague's hand that beckoned him. We reached one such establishment in the late afternoon, a dingy yet pretentious hall whose windows were screened against prying eyes. Holmes, by dint of a borrowed card and his own powers of persuasion, gained us admittance. The place reeked of smoke and spilled brandy, and the low murmur of voices was punctuated by the rattle of dice and the clink of coins. At a far table, surrounded by satellites, sat a man who answered precisely to Sir Alister's description, sleek of hair, florid of complexion, with a manner both ingratiating and insolent. Holmes approached with the air of one casually renewing an acquaintance. Mr. Montague, I believe? The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. And you, sir? A fellow dabbler in fortunes, Holmes replied smoothly, seating himself uninvited. Sherlock Holmes. You have heard the name. Montague's expression faltered for an instant, then hardened. What is your business with me? Holmes leaned forward, his tone deceptively mild. A trifle merely. You were acquainted with Edward St. Clair? The man's fingers toyed with a glass of claret. I knew him. A promising young fellow, cut down most tragically. But surely you do not come to me for mourning attire. I come, said Holmes, because St. Clair was found dead with a note in his pocket, written in a hand not unlike your own. Montague's glass slipped and shattered upon the floor. He recovered himself quickly, but not before I saw a flicker of fear cross his face. A preposterous suggestion. I had no part in his death? Perhaps not. Yet you will admit that you summoned him? I admit nothing. Montague rose, his voice rising with him. I will not be questioned in this manner. Good evening, sir. He turned on his heel and strode toward the door, his followers murmuring uneasily. Holmes watched him go, his face unreadable. Only when we were once more in the chill night air did he speak. Watson, the man's guilt lies not in what he said, but in what he dared not say. That broken glass was eloquent. Montague knows the hand that wrote that note, whether it be his own or another's. And until we uncover his secret, Edward St. Clair's death will remain unsolved. Come, we must redouble our efforts. For I fear that before this web is untangled, another will be snared within it. Word count. 1400 Holmes's stride quickened as we left the smoky haunt behind us, his cloak billowing in the damp night air. He neither spoke nor glanced at me until we were some distance down the Strand, the rattle of cabs and cries of newsboys mingling with the muffled hum of the city. At last he drew me into a quieter street and stopped beneath a gas lamp, his lean face pale but animated with suppressed excitement. You observed, Watson, how Montague's composure cracked at the mention of the note. That was no feigned start. It betrayed familiarity, not merely surprise. He may not have penned the words, but he knows their author, and his guilty knowledge binds him to the crime more securely than a rope. And yet, I ventured, knowledge alone is not guilt. He may have feared implication without having raised his hand against St. Clair. Holmes gave a curt nod. True. But recall the convergence of facts, Montague's connection with St. Clair, his reputation for dubious dealings, his travels in South America where curarine is known, and the Soho stationer's account of a dark-haired gentleman purchasing paper identical to that of the note. These are not straws floating idly. They are fibers weaving a rope. We walked on, and Holmes flagged down a hansom. back to Baker Street. I must reflect, and reflection comes best in familiar surroundings. Tonight's encounter has given us more than you think. Once within our rooms, Holmes threw himself into his armchair, lit his pipe, and sat enveloped in smoke. I had learned to wait patiently in such moments, for his mind moved swiftly in silence, arranging fragments into patterns invisible to others. At length he leaned forward, tapping the bowl of his pipe against the grate. Montague fears exposure. Yet if he were sole author of the crime, would he not have sought to brazen it out, or at least deny all knowledge more calmly? His agitation suggests partnership, or rather, that he is but one actor in a larger drama. St. Clair was drawn into a snare with more than one hunter. I was about to reply when a knock sounded. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. St. Clair seen in company of Montague 2 nights before wedding. Information from reliable source. Suggest immediate inquiry. Lestrade. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Excellent. Confirmation of what we already surmised. But we must press further. Watson, tomorrow we pay another visit to Miss Denham. She may, unwittingly, hold the key. The following afternoon found us once more in Belgravia. Miss Denham received us in a small withdrawing room, her face pale but composed. Holmes regarded her gently yet keenly. Miss Denham, I fear I must disturb your sorrow with painful questions. Did Mr. St. Clair ever speak to you of Felix Montague? She started slightly, then shook her head. He mentioned him once in passing. He said Montague had interests that might advance the shipping firm, but I disliked the man. His manner, so bold, so insinuating, repelled me. Holmes inclined his head. You are a shrewd observer. Did you ever notice in Edward's behavior of late signs of unease, anxiety, secrecy? She hesitated, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. Yes. A week before our wedding, he seemed troubled. He received a letter which he read in private, and afterwards he was restless. I asked him what it was, but he kissed my hand and told me not to worry. I thought it but the natural nervousness of a bridegroom. Do you still possess that letter? No, he destroyed it immediately after reading. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then we must assume its contents were grave indeed. Miss Denham, forgive one final inquiry. On the night before the wedding, did Edward return home at his usual hour? Her eyes filled with sudden tears. No, he came later than was his wont. When I asked where he had been, he said only that business had detained him. He seemed strangely abstracted. That was the last time I saw him alive. Holmes rose and bowed with grave courtesy. Your candor has been most helpful, Miss Denham. You have given me what I sought, the evidence that Edward was being pressed, even threatened in those final days. I shall do all that lies within my power to avenge him. Back in our cab, I could restrain myself no longer. Holmes, it is plain. Montague, with his sordid connections, threatened St. Clair, perhaps to extort money. When St. Clair refused, he silenced him. Holmes smiled faintly. You argue well, Watson, but too swiftly. If extortion were Montague's aim, would he not profit more by St. Clair alive than dead? A man cannot pay debts from the grave. No, murder served some other end, but what? That is the riddle. That evening, as twilight deepened into fog-laden night, Holmes paced the sitting room with restless energy. Watson, when facts resist arrangement, one must seek a fresh angle. We have pursued Montague directly. Let us instead examine his surroundings. What if we learn not what Montague says, but whom he meets? We must follow him. Thus it was that later that night, Holmes and I, muffled in heavy coats and hats, stationed ourselves near the gaming hall. For an hour nothing stirred save the passage of cabs and the muttered calls of hawkers. Then shortly after 10, Montague emerged. He glanced furtively about, then strode quickly into the fog. Holmes touched my arm. The play begins, Watson. Keep close. We shadowed him through twisting streets, our footsteps muffled by mist. At length he turned into a narrow alley near Soho and entered a mean lodging house. Holmes drew me into the shadow of a doorway opposite. Note the address. We shall return by day, he whispered. But wait, what's this? Another figure approached swiftly, cloaked and hooded. The newcomer gave a brief knock and was admitted at once. The door closed, leaving only silence. Holmes's breath hissed softly between his teeth. Two conspirators, Watson. Montague is not alone. The hour grows late, but tomorrow we shall learn who else moves in this sinister design. For the veil is thinning, and behind it lies the true hand that struck Edward St. Clair. Word count, 1400. The following morning broke clear but chill, a pale sun struggling through the London haze. Holmes, who had scarcely slept, was already at his dressing table when I awoke, tying his cravat with quick, precise movements. His energy seemed renewed, as though the nocturnal watch had only whetted his appetite for the hunt. "Watson," said he, turning with that gleam in his eye which I had come to recognize as the herald of action, "our quarry has scurried into its burrow. Today we probe the earth. We must see who occupies that lodging-house in Soho and whether last night's visitor is a figure already known to us. A cloak and hood conceal much, but not everything. We fortified ourselves with a hasty breakfast and set out. The streets bustled with costermongers and carts, and the cries of newsboys hawking the latest sensation about the bridegroom without a pulse were everywhere. At the lodging-house, a grimy affair with a crooked signboard and cracked windows, Holmes presented himself with the easy air of one accustomed to entering anywhere. He asked casually of the landlady whether rooms might be had. The woman, sharp-eyed and suspicious, replied that they were taken. Holmes pressed her with genial persistence, producing a coin between finger and thumb. At length her tongue loosened. "We've 2 gentlemen as lodgers here. A dark one, flashy in his dress, and another quieter, keeps himself close. Don't mix with the other boarders. They came but last week." Holmes leaned on the counter with feigned indifference. "Indeed, and the quieter one, what manner of man is he?" The woman shrugged. "Can't say. He goes out late, comes back later. Foreign, maybe. Keeps to himself. Keeps to himself." Holmes nodded as though satisfied with a trifle, and we withdrew. Once in the street, he quickened his pace. "A foreigner, Watson. Recall the handwriting, those angular characters of continental training. The note may well have been his. Montague supplies the local color, the connections. His associate provides the expertise. A partnership of greed and science. We had not gone 2 streets when a sudden exclamation burst from Holmes. He drew me sharply into a shop doorway, his gaze fixed ahead. A cab had halted at the corner, and from it descended none other than Godfrey Ewart. He strode directly toward the lodging-house, glanced once about him, and entered. Holmes's hand closed on my arm. "Watson, the circle tightens!" Ewart, Montague, and a foreign accomplice, all within that dingy hive. "The clue lies here, I am certain." We resumed our vigil, remaining in the shadows while the fog thickened once more. After half an hour, the door opened again. Ewart emerged, his face pale, his movements agitated. He hailed no cab, but walked swiftly in the direction of Oxford Street. Holmes gave a low whistle. "Curious, Watson. Very curious. His nerves betray him. That meeting was fraught with import. I would give much to know the words exchanged within." He fell silent, pacing the pavement in restless thought. "We cannot break in openly, too soon, and we risk losing all. No, patience, patience. Tonight we return, and not as ourselves. I have a disguise in mind that will carry us over the threshold." The day passed in restless anticipation. Holmes busied himself with wigs, pigment, and garments from his inexhaustible store, until by evening he had transformed himself into a bent and shabby book peddler, his features so altered I scarcely recognized him. For myself, he fashioned the appearance of a clerk fallen on hard times. My mustache thickened, my clothes patched and ill-fitting. Thus arrayed, we returned to Soho under cover of dusk. Holmes led the way with a basket of tattered volumes slung upon his arm. He rapped upon the lodging-house door, and when the landlady appeared, whined in the cracked voice of a hawker. "Books, madam, cheap as dirt, and knowledge to warm the heart." She waved him off impatiently, but he persisted, shuffling one foot within the doorway. At that instant, a man's voice called from within, sharp and impatient. It was Montague. "Who is there?" "Send them away!" Holmes contrived to stumble, spilling a volume onto the floor within the threshold. He stooped to retrieve it, and in that instant his keen eyes darted inside. I caught only a glimpse over his shoulder, a narrow passage, and at the far end, a door half ajar through which came the murmur of voices. One low and foreign, another unmistakably Ewart's. Holmes straightened, offered a mocking bow to the landlady, and allowed himself to be thrust back into the street. Once clear, his eyes gleamed with triumph. "Enough, Watson!" I needed only to hear. Ewart and Montague are in conference with their mysterious ally at this very moment. The triumvirate is complete. But why do they conspire? To conceal their part in St. Clair's death, assuredly, but there must be more. Men do not hazard such risk for mere self-preservation. There is a prize yet hidden from us. We lingered in the street until well after midnight. At last the foreigner departed, cloaked and hurried, while Montague and Ewart remained behind. Holmes's eyes followed the man intently. "Tomorrow we track him. His movements will reveal the design. Tonight we withdraw. The game ripens, and we must not pluck the fruit before it is full." As we returned to Baker Street, my mind reeled with conjectures, but Holmes was silent, immersed in thought. Only as we mounted the steps to our familiar rooms did he speak, his voice low and deliberate. "Watson, mark my words, this affair is no ordinary crime of passion or greed. It is a scheme of rare subtlety, and St. Clair's death is but one chord in a darker symphony. We are on the threshold of revelation, but before we step across, we must be ready to face danger, such as few men have lived to recount. Word count. 1400 Holmes was astir before the light of dawn had fully pierced the blinds. I heard him moving briskly about the sitting room, and when I emerged, still heavy with sleep, I found him poring over a map of London, the foreigner's nocturnal path traced in pencil across its streets. He greeted me with a brief nod, his eyes alight with that cold fire which bespoke a plan already taking form. "Our stranger," he said, tapping the map, "left Soho and made directly eastward, toward the docks. He is not a casual conspirator, Watson, but a man with purpose, and his steps lead to the river. Where the Thames flows, secrets flow with it. Today we follow his trail. We fortified ourselves with strong coffee and set out into the morning fog. The streets of London awoke around us, tradesmen throwing open shutters, hansoms rattling over cobblestones, costermongers crying their wares. Holmes, with his long stride and unerring instinct for pursuit, led us through twisting alleys until the air grew rank with tar, hemp, and salt. We reached a row of warehouses, their walls blackened with soot, their yards cluttered with barrels and crates. Holmes halted, scanning the scene with hawk-like intensity. "There," he murmured, indicating a warehouse whose door stood ajar. A figure slipped inside, wrapped in the same cloak we had glimpsed the night before. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Our man. Keep to the shadows, Watson." We advanced cautiously. From within came the creak of wood and the scrape of iron. Holmes crouched by a knothole in the timber wall and beckoned me to look. I stooped, my eye meeting a dim scene within. The foreigner conversed in low tones with two rough seamen, while at their feet rested a small chest bound with brass. The man tapped the chest with a gesture of pride, and though I could not catch every word, the guttural accent carried a sinister cadence. Holmes touched my arm, and we withdrew to a safer distance. His voice, when he spoke, was taut with suppressed excitement. "Watson, we approach the heart of the mystery. That chest, did you mark it? There lies the object for which St. Clair died. Poison, secrecy, conspirators, they are but scaffolding erected to guard that prize." I asked what it might contain, but Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. To speculate would be folly, but we must not allow it to vanish downriver. The docks are the conspirators' ally. Once aboard a vessel, the chest may be beyond our reach forever. We must learn which ship claims it." He drew me into a neighboring tavern, grimy and low-ceilinged, frequented by sailors. Holmes, adopting once more the guise of a book peddler, engaged a surly mariner in conversation, pressing coins into his hand. Presently he returned, satisfaction gleaming in his eye. "The foreigner is known here as a passenger bound for Antwerp aboard the Helios, sailing within 48 hours. The chest is destined for her hold. That, Watson, is our window of opportunity." We lingered in the tavern until the foreigner emerged from the warehouse, now unburdened. He strode away swiftly, disappearing into the warren of alleys. Holmes watched him go, then signaled me to follow. We tracked him westward, through markets and by streets, until at last he paused outside the Corinthian Club. To my astonishment, Montague himself awaited him at the steps. The two exchanged a brief but earnest conversation before parting, Montague hailing a cab while the foreigner vanished once more into the crowd. Holmes's hand tightened upon his cane. The alliance is confirmed. Montague and the foreigner conspire, and Ewart is their tool or their accomplice. Yet still the question of motive looms. Why kill Edward St. Clair? What tie binds his death to that chest now hidden in a dockside warehouse? That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes stood long at the window, the smoke from his pipe curling upward as he watched the lamps of London flicker through the mist. "Watson," he said at last, "there are forces here which reach beyond a single family tragedy. The death of St. Clair was not an end, but a means. Montague seeks something larger, fortune perhaps, or power, and the foreigner is the key. Tomorrow we act. We must inspect that chest with our own eyes, for within it lies the truth that will bind this tangled skein into a single thread." He turned sharply, the lamplight catching the keen profile of his face. "But we must be cautious. If Montague suspects our interference, the prize will be spirited away, and with it our chance to unmask the crime. The next move is ours, Watson, and it must be played with precision. For the board is set, and one false step may bring the whole edifice crashing down upon us." Word count: 1,400. Holmes wasted no time in setting his plan into motion. Early the next morning, under a veil of mist that rolled heavily from the river, we made our way toward the wharves. His manner was brisk, and his eyes gleamed with that concentrated energy which I had learned to recognize as the herald of decisive action. He had furnished himself with a forged pass, one of those official-looking slips of paper that, in his hands, opened more doors than the keys of the most trusted watchman. I carried a small medical bag at his suggestion, so that we might pass for a physician and his assistant on some errand of inspection. The docks teemed with life, rough voices shouting over the creak of winches and the splash of cargo into barges. The Helios lay moored among a forest of masts, her black hull rising sheer above the waterline, the name picked out in gold upon her stern. Holmes surveyed her keenly, then steered me toward the warehouse where we had seen the chest the previous day. With a few curt words and the flourish of his pass, he gained us admittance. The foreman, a thick-set fellow, eyed us suspiciously, but did not challenge the authority Holmes so confidently assumed. Inside, the air was heavy with the mingled odors of tar, spices, and damp timber. Holmes moved quickly between the stacks of cargo until he found what he sought. There, set apart as though awaiting special handling, rested the brass-bound chest. It was unremarkable in appearance, save for a peculiar set of symbols scorched into its lid, marks which at first sight I took for some foreign alphabet. Holmes bent low, running his long fingers across them with the tender precision of a scholar. "Do you recognize it, Watson?" he asked softly. I confessed I did not. "It is no alphabet," said he, "but a cipher, a merchant's code, used to designate certain consignments of exceptional value. I have seen its like among smugglers who traffic in contraband jewels. This chest does not contain mere merchandise. It contains fortune." Even as he spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Holmes drew me swiftly into the shadow of a towering crate. Through a narrow gap, we observed the foreigner enter with 2 dockhands. He spoke in guttural tones, gesturing impatiently toward the chest. The men lifted it, staggering slightly under its weight, and bore it toward the waiting ship. The foreigner followed, his eyes alert, his manner commanding. Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "We are too late to examine it here. But its very removal is to our advantage. Once aboard, it must be registered, and registration leaves a trail. Let us follow quietly and see how matters develop." We trailed them across the yard and onto the gangplank of the Helios. Holmes's pass served us once more, and we mingled among the bustle of sailors loading provisions. The chest disappeared below deck, carried into the dim recesses of the hold. The foreigner exchanged a few words with the mate, then returned ashore, leaving orders in his wake. Holmes touched my elbow. "Did you note, Watson? He will not sail himself. He entrusts the chest to others. That means he intends to remain in London at least until the vessel departs. Our quarry does not flee yet. This gives us time, though perilously little." As we withdrew from the docks, Holmes's mind was plainly racing. He muttered half-formed sentences, calculations of time and tide, references to customs officers and ship registries. Finally, he halted and regarded me with that sudden intensity which always heralded some bold maneuver. "Watson, the chest is the fulcrum. Upon it rests the entire conspiracy. St. Clair's death was to ensure that he could not reveal, or perhaps could not obstruct, its removal. But what is in it? Jewels, gold, bonds, whatever the form, it is treasure enough to bind Montague, Ewart, and their foreign ally together in a pact of murder. Our task is to prove it. To do so, we must see its contents before the Helios sails. Tonight, under cover of darkness, we return to the ship. There will be risk, but without risk, truth is seldom gained. I confess my heart sank at the thought of nocturnal trespass aboard a vessel guarded by rough seamen. Yet I had long since pledged myself to Holmes's side in whatever dangers his genius might lead us. That evening, as the fog thickened once more and the river lapped black and silent against the piers, Holmes produced from his cupboard a coil of rope, a dark lantern, and 2 pistols. He examined each with meticulous care, then stowed them beneath his cloak. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "The night favors us. If fortune smiles, tomorrow we shall look upon the heart of this mystery. But tread softly, for a single misstep may plunge us both into the Thames, and the truth with us." Word count. 1400, the night was still, the mist lying low upon the river so that the lamps along the wharf seemed suspended in a haze of pale fire. Holmes and I moved swiftly and without speech, our footsteps muffled by the damp planks. The Helios loomed ahead, her dark hull a silent wall against the shifting fog. Holmes signaled me to crouch low as a pair of seamen passed along the quay. When the way was clear, he drew me toward the shadow of a mooring post, and with a practiced hand he secured the rope he carried. "We must go aboard unseen," he whispered. "The gangplank is watched. We take the riverside." He slipped over the edge with the nimbleness of a cat, descending the rope until his feet touched the narrow ledge of the vessel's hull just above the waterline. I followed with less grace, my medical bag thumping awkwardly against my side, yet at last I stood beside him, the cold river licking at our boots. Holmes led the way along the slick timbers until we reached a small hatch partly concealed by a stack of casks. Producing a slender tool, he worked swiftly at the fastening, and within moments the hatch yielded with scarcely a sound. We slipped inside, closing it gently behind us. The air of the hold was close and heavy, the scent of hemp, spices, and tar mingling in the darkness. Holmes kindled the dark lantern, shading its light with his hand. By its faint glow, we threaded our way among crates and barrels until we came to the spot where earlier that day we had seen the chest carried. There it rested still, squat and ominous in the flickering light, the brass fittings glimmering dully, the scorched cipher marks seeming almost to writhe like serpents upon the wood. Holmes bent low, his fingers tracing the edges of the lock. "A foreign make," he murmured. "Complex, but not beyond me. Keep watch, Watson." I stationed myself a few paces off, pistol in hand, straining my ears for any sound of intrusion. The creak of the vessel, the lap of water against her side, and the muffled shouts from the wharf above were all that reached me. After some minutes, Holmes gave a low exclamation of triumph, and the lock yielded with a soft click. He lifted the lid a few inches, then paused, his nostrils flaring. "Do you perceive it, Watson? A faint odor, dry, acrid, metallic." I bent closer and caught the scent. "It is unfamiliar to me." "Gold dust," he whispered. "Refined and packed for transport. See?" He raised the lid higher, and within lay sacks neatly bound, their seams faintly glimmering where fine powder clung. "Here lies the answer to our riddle. Montague and his accomplice have smuggled treasure on a scale vast enough to tempt any fortune hunter. Edward St. Clair discovered their plot, whether by accident or design, and for that he was silenced." Even as he spoke, a sudden creak echoed through the hold. Holmes extinguished the lantern and pressed me into the shadow of a towering crate. Footsteps descended the ladder, cautious yet deliberate. A voice, low but distinct, spoke in guttural tones. Another answered in the smoother accents of Montague. My heart thudded as the two figures advanced, the faint glow of their own lantern revealing them in outline. Keep it secure, Montague muttered. The Helios sails at dawn. Once we have the proceeds in Antwerp, none can touch us. Ewart is weak, but he dares not betray us now. The foreigner gave a short, harsh laugh. Weak men are useful until they falter. If he speaks, he dies as St. Clair died. Holmes's hand closed like a vice upon my arm, warning me to silence. The conspirators bent over the chest, Montague fingering the sacks with a greedy caress. At length they replaced the lid, secured the lock, and withdrew, their lantern glow fading as they ascended. Only when their footsteps had vanished did Holmes release me, his breath audible in the darkness. You heard, Watson. The plan is laid bare. Greed, smuggling, and murder entwined. But note this. Ewart trembles. He is the flaw in their design. If we can turn him, the whole edifice will collapse. We retraced our steps with infinite caution, regaining the riverside and descending to the ledge once more. The fog thickened about us, and with careful climbing we reached the quay. Holmes stood a moment, drawing deep breaths of the cold air, his eyes glittering. Watson, we are upon the brink. Tomorrow we confront Ewart. He holds the key, whether through confession freely given or confession wrung by fear. And when his lips are opened, the fate of Montague and his foreign accomplice will be sealed. Word count, 1400. The following day was raw and damp. The sky a dull canopy of lead through which no ray of sun could penetrate. Holmes had scarcely rested, yet his step was firm and his mind alert as we made our way once more to the Corinthian Club, where Ewart was said to spend his hours in uneasy idleness. His manner the previous evening had betrayed a man wrestling with dread, and Holmes was resolved to exploit that weakness before it hardened into defiance. We were admitted into a private parlor where Ewart awaited us. His appearance had altered markedly. The florid color of youth was gone, replaced by a sallow pallor. His eyes, restless and bloodshot, betrayed sleepless nights, and his hand shook visibly as he poured a measure of brandy from a decanter at his elbow. He started when he saw Holmes as though an uninvited phantom had entered his chamber. "You have no right to intrude upon me," he cried, though his voice lacked conviction. "I will not be badgered with questions. Leave me, I beg you!" Holmes advanced, calm yet relentless, his gaze fixed upon the young man with the force of a surgeon probing a wound. "Mr. Ewart," he said, "your nerves betray you more eloquently than your words. The path you tread leads only to ruin. Montague and his foreign accomplice are content to let you bear the peril while they reap the profit. You stand upon the brink of destruction, but I extend my hand. Take it, and you may yet be saved." Ewart attempted a defiant laugh, but it broke into a cough. "Saved? You know nothing of it." "I know this much," Holmes said sharply. "I know of the chest aboard the Helios bound for Antwerp. I know of the gold dust it contains. I know that Edward St. Clair learned of the scheme and would have revealed it, had not a poisoned needle stilled his tongue. And I know above all that you were present in the lodging-house where Montague and his ally conspired. Do you deny it?" The glass fell from Ewart's hand and shattered upon the floor. He sank into a chair, covering his face. "For God's sake," he whispered, "how do you know these things?" Holmes placed a hand upon his shoulder, his tone gentler now. "It is my business to know. But knowledge alone cannot condemn you. You have been used, Mr. Ewart, drawn into a plot whose architects will discard you as they did your friend, once your usefulness is ended. Tell me the truth, and I will see that you are shielded from their vengeance." There was a long silence. At last, Ewart raised his head, his eyes glistening with the torment of one who stands between fear and conscience. "You speak truth, Mr. Holmes. Montague ensnared me with promises of wealth. He spoke of opportunities in South America, of shipments to be shared, fortunes to be made. I was young, foolish, envious of Edward's inheritance. I listened. When the chest arrived, he told me it was but a trifle of contraband, soon turned to gold. I did not know at first of the poison. I swear it. And when did you know?" Holmes asked swiftly. "On the eve of the wedding. Edward had discovered something. How, I cannot say. He confronted Montague, threatened to expose the scheme. Montague was beside himself with rage. The foreigner, he called himself Renaud, produced the syringe. I begged them not to use it, but they laughed at my weakness. They said Edward would ruin us all, that he must be silenced. I was powerless. I watched, oh God, I watched as they plotted his death. They chose the wedding for its finality, its certainty. None would suspect foul play at such a moment. And when he fell, Ewart broke off, his voice choked with horror. Holmes's eyes shone with cold triumph. Enough! Your confession is the keystone. With it, the arch of their deception crumbles. Montague and Renaud shall be ensnared in the trap they themselves have set. But what of me? Ewart whispered. Will you deliver me to the law? That depends upon your conduct henceforth, Holmes replied sternly. Assist me in securing their downfall, and I shall plead for mercy on your behalf. Fail, and you shall share their fate. Ewart bowed his head in mute assent. Outside in the foggy street, Holmes spoke in quick, decisive tones. Watson, the case approaches its climax. Tonight we intercept Montague and Renaud at the docks. With Ewart's testimony and the evidence of the chest, we shall have all that is required. Yet we must move swiftly, for the Helios sails with the tide. If we falter, the gold is gone, and justice with it. He hailed a cab, and as we rattled toward Scotland Yard, he leaned close, his voice low but firm. This night will be dangerous, Watson. There may be violence. Arm yourself and keep your wits, for the hour has come when the hunters must stand face to face with the prey. Word count. 1400 Holmes's plan moved with the swiftness of one long matured in his mind. By evening we had conferred with Lestrade at the yard, laying before him both the confession wrung from Ewart and the intelligence we had gathered concerning the chest aboard the Helios. The inspector, though at first incredulous, was soon swept along by the force of Holmes's reasoning. He placed a detachment of men at our disposal, their orders clear and uncompromising. Montague and Renaud were to be taken in the act. Ewart, pale and trembling, was kept under guard, his testimony to be preserved as the weapon that would drive the nail into Montague's coffin. The night drew down thick and heavy, the fog rolling from the river in long spectral billows that muffled every sound. We assembled near the dockside, a shadowy company of detectives hidden among warehouses and cranes. Holmes stood motionless at my side, his eyes fixed upon the gangplank of the Helios, his features as calm as if he awaited the overture of some concert rather than the perilous stroke of justice. At length the figures we sought appeared. Montague, resplendent in cloak and hat despite the murk, strode with brisk authority, Renaud following close, his sharp features caught once in the flare of a lantern. Between them moved two hired men bearing the brass-bound chest upon a handcart. The scrape of its wheels echoed across the cobbles, a sound that seemed to strike my very nerves like a file. Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. Steady, Watson. We must allow them to commit themselves. Another 20 yards, and the trap closes. The conspirators reached the gangplank. Montague gave an order, and the chest was hoisted aboard. In that instant, Holmes raised his arm. From every shadow yard men sprang forth, their revolvers glinting in the lamplight. A shout, a rush, and the dock erupted in sudden chaos. Renaud wheeled like a wild beast at bay, producing from his coat a slender pistol. He fired once, the shot ringing sharp through the fog. A detective cried out, wounded. Holmes was already upon him, striking the weapon from his grasp with the iron precision of his cane. Montague, meanwhile, had turned to flee, but Lestrade barred his path, and after a brief struggle he was secured. His cries of outrage drowned in the tumult. The dock hands, seeing the fate of their masters, flung up their hands in surrender. Within minutes the affair was ended. The chest, pried open under the lantern glow, revealed its glittering secret beyond doubt. Sacks of gold dust lay within, the wealth of a kingdom smuggled beneath false papers. The sight drew an audible murmur from the men, but Holmes silenced them with a gesture. "This," said he, his voice ringing clear, "is the fruit of avarice and deceit. Edward St. Clair uncovered the truth, and for that he was slain. But justice has long arms, and tonight they close around the guilty. They close around the guilty." Renaud was dragged away, snarling in his foreign tongue, while Montague, pale and furious, declared his innocence with every breath. Holmes regarded him coldly. You may proclaim what you will, Montague. The evidence is written not in words, but in deeds. You plotted to enrich yourself at the cost of a man's life, and the law shall deal with you accordingly. The chest was secured under guard, and the prisoners conveyed to the yard. As the tumult subsided, Holmes and I stood once more in the quiet of the riverfront, the fog wreathing about us like the closing curtain of a play. He drew a long breath, his keen features relaxing at last. "Watson," said he, "the case is finished. Tomorrow the papers will cry out in triumph at the fall of Montague and his accomplice. Yet let us remember that behind the headlines lies the silent tragedy of a young life cut short. It is not victory that moves me tonight, but the thought of Miss Denham, whose future has been darkened by this crime. She has lost much, though at least she may know that the man she loved did not fall through weakness, but through courage in the face of villainy." He turned his gaze upon the black sweep of the Thames, where faint lights glimmered upon the water. "The river bears away many secrets, Watson. This one, by fortune, we have wrested from its current. Let us hope that justice, once set upon its course, flows as steadily as the tide." Word count, 1400. The following morning broke with a pale light filtering through the curtains of Baker Street, and I found Holmes already seated, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze distant. The tumult of the previous night had scarcely subsided in my mind, yet he appeared calm, almost contemplative, as though the affair already lay filed and sealed in the great catalogue of his memory. A pile of newspapers upon the table bore lurid headlines: "Smuggler's Plot Foiled by Mr. Sherlock Holmes," and "Bridegroom's Death Avenged," yet Holmes scarcely glanced at them. "Public applause," he said at length, "is a coin I never cared to earn. What matters is the satisfaction of truth revealed and villainy unmasked. Yet I confess, Watson, there are corners of this business that still demand reflection." I looked up from the morning's article. "You astonish me, Holmes. The culprits are in custody, the treasure secured, and Ewart has confessed his part. What more can there be?" He smiled faintly. "Always, my dear fellow, there is the question of why. Not the shallow motive of greed alone, but the deeper currents that carry men to crime. Montague was bold, Renaud ruthless, but it was St. Clair's moral courage that destroyed them. Had he been less resolute, less determined to thwart dishonor, he might yet live, though in ignorance. One wonders which fate is the crueler." Before I could reply, a knock sounded, and Lestrade entered, his face brisk with satisfaction. "All secure, Mr. Holmes." Montague rails at his captors, and the foreigner sulks in silence. "Their trial will be the talk of the season. Ewart, with luck, may receive some leniency, though I doubt the court will pass lightly over his complicity. Still, you have done the country a service. The treasury itself is stirred by the recovery of so vast a hoard." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "I ask only that Miss Denham's name be kept unsullied. Let the record show that her betrothed died not in folly, but as the unwitting guardian of England's honor against foreign thieves." Lestrade assented and withdrew, leaving us once more in quiet. For a long while Holmes was silent, his gaze fixed upon the curling smoke of his pipe. At last he rose and drew back the curtains, gazing out upon the bustling street below, where costermongers cried their wares and cabmen urged on their horses through the clatter of the morning traffic. "Life resumes its ceaseless march," he murmured. "The world forgets quickly, Watson, but we who have looked upon the darker face of man cannot forget so easily. St. Clair's bride will carry the shadow of this case to her grave. Montague and Renaud will pay the law's penalty. But no gallows can restore the lost promise of a wedding day turned funeral." He turned back to me with a sudden briskness, as though shaking off the melancholy that had momentarily overtaken him. "Come, Watson, the day is young, and there will be fresh enigmas awaiting us before long. It is the curse and the blessing of London that villainy never sleeps. Let us leave the newspapers to their readers and prepare ourselves for the next summons to the chase." Thus ended the affair of the bridegroom without a pulse, a case which, in its mingling of avarice, betrayal, and tragic courage, impressed itself upon my memory more deeply than many triumphs of my friend's singular genius. Though Holmes would dismiss his role as merely the logical pursuit of truth, I could not but marvel at the relentless clarity with which he traced each thread through the fog of deceit until the entire pattern stood revealed. And as I watched him now, serene in his armchair, the firelight gleaming upon his keen features, I reflected once more that while London teemed with mysteries, there was only one mind capable of piercing them with such precision, the mind of Sherlock Holmes. Word count, 1400. The days that followed were a whirl of public excitement. Everywhere the case was discussed, in taverns, drawing rooms, and the very carriages that rattled through the thoroughfares. The Helios, once destined to slip away laden with illicit treasure, became a symbol of justice regained, her name emblazoned across broadsheets. Yet for all the clamor, Holmes received it with the same cool detachment he accorded to every triumph. He accepted no interviews, refused all invitations to dine in his honor, and spent long hours in silent contemplation at the window of Baker Street, as though searching beyond the smoke-laden sky for threads of thought invisible to lesser men. One evening, while I sat opposite him with my notes, shaping them into a coherent account of the affair, he stirred at last and regarded me with that half-smile which often prefaced his most incisive observations. "You propose, Watson, to set this case down in your chronicles?" "I do. It is too remarkable, too dramatic, not to be recorded. Yet I wonder whether the public will believe it. So theatrical were its turns." "The public believes what it wishes," he returned dryly. "Yet remember this, omit nothing of the truth. That is your duty as it is mine. The facts, however improbable, are always more curious than any invention. I promise to be faithful." And he fell once more into silence. Presently Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a tray. Holmes took it, raised his brows, and passed it to me. It bore the name Sir Alistair Denham. Within minutes the baronet was shown into our sitting room. His tall frame seemed more stooped, his hair more gray than when last we saw him. He grasped Holmes's hand with quiet dignity. "Mr. Holmes, I could not allow this affair to close without offering you my gratitude. You have lifted from my daughter's name a shadow that threatened to ruin her life. She has borne her sorrow with fortitude, but she finds comfort in knowing her betrothed died not through folly, but through courage." Holmes inclined his head. "Sir, your daughter's strength honors the memory of St. Clair more than any words of mine could do. Yet I fear she has endured a trial that few of her years could sustain." The baronet's voice trembled. "She will carry it always, but time may soften the pain. What consoles her is the thought that Edward acted nobly, that he sought to protect others even as he faced peril himself. That, Mr. Holmes, was revealed only through your efforts. For that, we are in your debt." Holmes, with uncharacteristic gentleness, placed a hand upon the man's shoulder. "I accept no debt, Sir Alistair, save that of truth to the living and the dead. Let your daughter remember St. Clair as a man who died because he refused to be silent in the face of wickedness. Such courage is rare, and it deserves remembrance without shame." After the baronet's departure, Holmes remained standing at the window, gazing into the street where hansoms clattered and hawkers called. "Watson," he said at last, "do you not perceive that justice, though served, is ever incomplete? We have secured Montague and Renault, yet the currents that bore them along, greed, ambition, the hunger for wealth unearned, still flow through London's veins. Tomorrow another Montague may rise, another Renault find fertile ground. The task is endless, and that is why I cannot rest." I observed him in silence, struck anew by the contradiction of the man. Cold and austere, yet capable of such intensity in the pursuit of justice. Detached from human sentiment, yet moved in his own way by the courage of those who resisted evil. It was in such moments that I most keenly felt the privilege of having stood beside him in his battles with the shadows of our city. That night, as the lamps glowed dimly and the fog crept once more along Baker Street, I laid aside my pen with the conviction that though London might never cease to produce mysteries, so long as Sherlock Holmes lived to confront them, there would remain at least one mind equal to their unraveling. Word count, 1400. It was some days later, when the clamor of the press had begun to wane, that the case acquired an unexpected coda. I had just returned from my rounds when I found Holmes in a posture of unusual animation, pacing the room with a letter crushed in his hand. His eyes gleamed with that restless light which spoke of a new stimulus to his tireless intellect. "You arrive at the moment, Watson," he said, thrusting the letter toward me. "Read and tell me what you make of it." The handwriting was bold and angular, the English tinged with foreign turns of phrase. It was unsigned, but its tenor was unmistakable. The writer congratulated Holmes on his victory in unmasking Montague and Renault, but warned that the gold was but a fragment of a greater enterprise. Other shipments, it declared, had already passed undetected, and men of far higher station than Montague were engaged in the scheme. The final lines chilled me with their menace. "Interfere again, and you too may find the pulse of your heart silenced, as St. Clair's was." I looked up to find Holmes regarding me with sardonic amusement. "A curious compliment, is it not? To be threatened is often the truest mark of success. Yet note, Watson, the precision of the writer's knowledge. He knows not merely of our triumph, but of the very method of St. Clair's death. That knowledge is confined to a circle no wider than ourselves, the yard and the criminals taken. That suggests a hand still at liberty." "You mean to say," I exclaimed, "that Montague and Renault were but instruments of a larger conspiracy?" "Precisely. Puppets whose strings were pulled from a higher perch. Montague's greed made him malleable. Renault's ruthlessness gave the scheme its edge, but neither possessed the reach to send such treasure abroad unchecked. There is another, a figure still in the shadows." The thought sobered me. "And what do you propose?" "Nothing yet," he replied with that abrupt calm which so often masked his deepest calculations. "We have secured the visible villains. To pursue shadows prematurely is to chase smoke. Still, the letter is a warning and a promise. We may not have heard the last of the bridegroom's case." He slipped the letter into his drawer, turned the key and resumed his violin, drawing from it a slow and haunting strain that seemed to echo the unease of the moment. The melody filled our chambers with its mournful cadences, and I reflected that even in triumph there lingered always the suggestion of unfinished business. Holmes paused at length, lowering the bow. "Watson," he said quietly, "the world imagines that crime may be neatly excised, like a tumor. But cut away one growth, and another sprouts in its place. It is not my task to heal the whole body of society, but to excise where I can, as cleanly as the knife permits. Yet never deceive yourself. This contest is without end." I could not answer, for the solemnity of his words struck me with a force beyond argument. And so, as the fog pressed once more against the windows of Baker Street and the city's ceaseless murmur drifted upward from the streets below, I understood that the case of the bridegroom without a pulse, though closed in law, remained open in the mind of Sherlock Holmes, whose restless spirit would never cease to seek the next thread in the endless tapestry of human crime. Word count: 1400 now. Generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective style. Holmes's prediction that the matter was not wholly closed proved all too accurate. A fortnight had scarcely passed when news reached us that Montague, awaiting trial in Newgate, had attempted to take his own life. Though thwarted, he remained sunk in a despair from which no questions could wring further testimony. Renault, on the other hand, proved defiant, maintaining his silence through every interrogation. It was clear they hoped to shield some greater power, and Holmes, though silent, observed with that cool detachment which never failed him when faced with unfinished puzzles. The anonymous letter lay often in his hands. He would turn it, study it, measure the spacing of its characters with his lens, yet for many days said nothing. At last, one evening, as we sat over our pipes, he spoke. "Watson, you will remember the peculiar phrasing of the letter, the foreign inflection, the precision of detail. I have compared it to samples in my files. The hand is that of a certain financier whose dealings have long skirted the edge of law. He holds a seat in Parliament, enjoys honors, and to outward view is the very pillar of society. Yet behind the mask lies the same hunger that drove Montague, only magnified by power. I was struck with astonishment. Surely such a man is beyond reach. For the moment, yes, Holmes admitted. To strike at him without unassailable proof would be to bring ruin upon ourselves. But the knowledge is not lost. It remains in my archives, awaiting the hour when the law may act without faltering. Meanwhile, we have done what could be done. We have cut away the nearest branch of the growth, though the root remains deep in the soil. There was in his tone neither triumph nor bitterness, only the measured acceptance of one who saw the world with clearer eyes than most. He leaned back, the faint smile playing about his lips. Take comfort, Watson. Though the game is unending, every check upon villainy is a gain. The life of Edward St. Clair was not squandered. His courage forced the conspirators into the open, and his memory is preserved unsullied in the heart of one who loved him. That, in the balance of things, is victory enough. And so it was that the case of the bridegroom without a pulse passed into history, not with the clang of final judgment, but with the quieter weight of truth half revealed and half concealed, as is so often the manner of life. To the world, it was a tale of smugglers brought low and treasure regained. To me, it was yet another proof of the unrelenting acuity of Sherlock Holmes, who, while others saw an ending, perceived only a turning of the wheel, the promise of future struggles against the ceaseless tide of crime. As I laid down my pen that night, I reflected that though Holmes himself disclaimed glory, I could not but feel awe at the strange fate which had placed me beside him. For while London slept wrapped in fog and indifference, here was one mind ever watchful, seeing through darkness into truth, a sentinel against the shadows. And I knew, as surely as I knew the beating of my own heart, that so long as Sherlock Holmes lived, the pulse of justice would never be stilled.